Every day we're confronted by evidence of the ever-widening chasm between the right and the left in America. And what's driving this hyper-polarization? We're also seeing so-called political solutions from both parties that don't seem to address our real issues. Our politics are ossified. Why, our most recent presidential election, we saw two 70-year-olds competing to see who could show more determination to bring steel mills back to Pittsburgh. Why are our politics so broken? And are there any solutions? For some answers, I turn to Yuval Levin and Arnold Kling, who have some intriguing ideas that I think I'd like to share with you. Among them is the damage done by the politics of nostalgia, and how the three languages of politics and three moral universes are driving us apart. And the solution, subsidiarity. Subsidiarity. Okay, what on earth is subsidiarity? And what on earth does all this mean? I think you'll find that this episode explains it. You'll never think about politics in the same way again.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome. I want to talk with you today about politics and policy at the 35,000-foot level. If you're like me, you're finding where we are pretty confusing about our politics, which seems to be quite fractured, and our economic policies, which also seem to be up in the air. With me today to talk about this are two brilliant, wise men, Yuval Levin and Arnold Kling. Yuval is editor of National Affairs, the Hertog Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's a senior editor at the New Atlantis and a contributing editor to National Review and the Weekly Standard. He also served in the White House domestic policy staff. He's the author, most recently, of The Fractured Republic, topic much on my mind today, which is about renewing America's social contract in the age of individualism. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. Yuval, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Arnold Kling is an independent scholar who received his PhD in economics from MIT. Previously, he was a researcher at the Congressional Budget Office, an economist at the Federal Reserve Board, and Freddie Mac. He also founded the internet startup homefair.com. He is the author of many books, most recently Specialization in Trade and The Three Languages of the Politics, which is going to be part of our conversation today. Welcome, Arnold.
Thanks,
Welcome.
Bill.
Welcome, Yuval. Arnold, you want to kick this off? Where are we with, well, let me just frame this a little bit. You've written in a very interesting way about the three languages of politics. And I'll let you describe that, which is one of the reasons why it's so hard for us to communicate with each other about solutions, because we occupy separate moral universes, or people in those camps do. And Yuval, you've written extremely interestingly about how we're living in amidst the politics of nostalgia, and both the left and right are dreaming of bygone days, which, in your view, and I think I share the view, are likely not to return. Arnold, tell us about the three languages. We talked about this in a previous show, but a quick Reader's Digest summary before we dive in would be helpful.
So I wrote this at a time when there was a lot of anger in politics, and now that anger has turned into outrage. And it describes the way each of three political tribes express outrage. The tribes I had were progressives, who express outrage at people that they believe side with oppressors against the oppressed. And then there are conservatives who express outrage at people who they believe side with the barbarians against civilization. And then the libertarians who express outrage at the people that they believe support the coercion of the state against the freedom of individuals. So I wrote that. And it's a reasonable description. I think politics has been somewhat upended by the more recent outbreaks, not just in the United States, but in other countries, of sort of anti-elitism. And I was thinking, actually, that if the United States were a parliamentary democracy, I think just as a lot of the major parties in Europe have seen a collapse in popularity, we would probably see the same thing here. I think the center-left might be collapsing. I think the center-right might be collapsing. I was asking if Yuval would consider himself part of the collapse of the center-right, and you denied that you would be.
Well, it feels like collapse. I just don't know about center-right, but yes. I mean, I agree with you. I think we're in a sense lucky to have a two-party system at this point, because otherwise things would seem even more out of control than they do.
We'll see what that's like when the far left takes over the Democratic Party and they win. You may not be quite as happy with the two-party system at that point.
Well, the guys in the House say, the Republicans in the House say they're basically two parties in the House. You've got the hardcore Tea Partiers, and then you've got the people that like it pretty much the way it is and want to keep that job and the House gym. And I suppose we've got the same things on the left. Talk about let's introduce the idea of the politics of nostalgia.
Yeah, well, so in a sense, I start from a similar place, from a sense that there's enormous frustration now in our politics. That's unavoidable. And the question is, why have we gotten to a place where both parties really are expressing different forms of frustrations with our political circumstances? And I think one way to understand that kind of moment is to step back and think about how people express themselves in politics. When you do that now, when you do that really over the last decade and more, what you find is an enormous amount of nostalgia on both sides, and it's nostalgia for a similar kind of time, though maybe for different reasons, where if you were just told that politician X gave a speech about how people used to go downtown and get a factory job and keep it for life, and maybe their kids could work at the same place, and that was a simpler time, and we've lost a lot since that time, it would actually be pretty hard to say if that politician was a Republican or a Democrat, or which kind of Republican or which kind of Democrat. It's what everybody says. And there is an implicit nostalgia for especially the United States of the post-World War II era, that in different ways the right and the left really exhibit. And, you know, we've just had a presidential election where two 70-year-olds ran against each other. It's hard to think of a better example of a country that thinks about the future by thinking about the past than the idea of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump arguing about who could more effectively bring steel back to Pittsburgh. It's a strange way to think about the purpose of our politics.
And you wrote that both Rick Santorum and Barack Obama, who don't exactly exist in the same political universe, gave essentially the same speech about how great things used to be. Yeah,
and looking to many of the same kind of points of example. Now, the right tends to emphasize the cultural side of the 1950s and 60s, the moral consensus, the high marriage rates, the high birth rates. The left tends to emphasize the economic cohesion of that time, the low inequality, the strong unions, the confidence in large institutions. These are different things, but they're both forms of nostalgia for an America made possible by a very peculiar kind of post-war moment. It is not how the country's usually been, and it's not how the country has been for quite a long time. And so the question for us is really, how do we come to terms with the ways America has changed since then, some of which are good and some of which are bad, and you have to use the good to address the bad.
Well, the best year for the left was the Great Society year of 1965, when they just launched all the good stuff that Lyndon Johnson
and no results were in yet, so
no results.
You can still believe in the promise.
They're in now.
Yeah.
And then the pinnacle for the right was in 1981.
Yeah,
the Reagan Revolution.
And again, probably results more mixed than people are willing to admit.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it certainly broke down one of the most important cultural norms, which was a norm around heading toward a balanced budget, and we don't know how that's going to play out. Some of us are quite nervous about where that's headed.
Yeah. But you know, every election in the 21st century has been about, do you prefer 1965 or 1981? and over, we've basically had an argument about which of those years was the best year. So it's, it's like the old joke in The Simpsons about soccer tournaments being about which is the best country, Portugal or Mexico. Well, I don't know. That's really not the question. Our politics for a long time now has been which is the best year, 65 or 81. And in the meantime, the country has been living in the 21st century, and we don't have enough of a politics geared to the challenges we actually confront in this time, and to the strengths we have, which we shouldn't underestimate.
So we have the three languages, maybe more languages, depending on where you are in the in Arnold's world, and then you've got the 1965 people, the 1981 people, and then the other division, which we pointed out, is the elites versus the rest of the country, and that seems to split in an entirely, that's not necessarily politically partisan. That's just people feeling left out of the 21st century.
Well, I think it's very much connected to this politics of nostalgia, because there is a sense that's, again, been growing since the beginning of this century and before, that our governing elites are disconnected from the realities of people's lives in a way that makes our politics have less and less to do with their real circumstances. And that frustration bubbles up, and it happens on the left and on the right. It's gotten to a place where our political leaders, 15 years after the beginning of the 21st century, when it should have been reasonably clear that the politics of this century were not going to be about how to govern after the end of history, but were going to be about some discrete challenges and difficulties. The best the two parties could come up with in 2016 was running Bill Clinton's wife and George W. Bush's brother for president. And the country looks at that and thinks, there's got to be a better way. I think that's behind a fair amount of the dissatisfaction of people with their own leadership.
Well, those are the politics, but there's also the economics, which is the subject that I'm as interested in as anything, is why, what do we think we have now versus what people are nostalgic for? And if you look at America after World War II, you point out, I think, Arnold, you've written on this as well, we had a United States economy which was the only surviving economy after World War II. Japan and Europe were flattened, and so we had really 2-3 decades of a world where we were very insulated from the forces at work that are at work now.
Yeah, I'm struck by, and I keep trying to emphasize to people just how much we have a different economy now than we did in 1960. 1960, we're still coming out of an era where heavy industry is what dominates. World War II was won by heavy industry, their ability to produce more steel, more tanks, more airplanes, and so on. We don't have that now. We have the world of intangible goods and services being most prominent, things that we see in Google, Facebook, and so on. So it's very different. One of my lines is the economy is something that evolves at the speed of culture, and we know that our culture is evolving rapidly. We just, some of it, Yuval might be very disappointed at the way it's evolving, but so we because it's embedded in culture, it evolves more rapidly than the physical world, and that's why economists have a hard time keeping up with it. And economists are still trying to look at the economy as if it were 1960 and we were allocating capital and labor, and it isn't that way anymore. And I think we've got a long way to go to catch up, to understand what's going on, to understand the wide divergences in the economy, the difference between what's going on in San Francisco versus Akron, the difference in prices shooting up in certain areas of real estate, in healthcare and higher education, prices coming down for consumer electronics. We used to have a much more homogeneous economy. Now it's much more divergent, and I don't know that we have the tools yet to understand it. And I think we're actually we're kind of falling further behind in our understanding of it.
I would say that's connected to a broader set of trends that I would describe as fragmentation more broadly. If you think about what's happened to American life since the 1960s, fragmentation is not a bad way to think about it. We went from an unusually consolidated form of American life after the war, after the Depression, and in every way we became more diverse culturally, we became more diverse economically, politically, and we have had a hard time coming to terms with some of what that means. What really strikes me about what Arnold says in a lot of his writing about this question is that the sheer fact of that diversity means that a lot of the tools we have for understanding our situation are out of date. And I think that really strikes you when you think about the intersection of the work that academic economists do and the work that policymakers do. Academic economics right now is unusually useless to policymakers. And you really know, you read the minutes of the Fed and they just kind of sit around thinking
unusually useless.
Yeah, look, so most of the social sciences are generally not useful to policymakers, right? Yeah. But I think if you were to look at exceptions, you would look to economics and you would look to foreign policy within political science. Two areas where academic work has often been very directly linked to the work of policymakers. In both of those cases now, the work being done in the academy is largely useless to policymakers. And policymakers feel adrift. They feel like they don't have any guidance. They don't have the right theories. So in economics, if you read the Fed minutes, they just don't know what's going on. And the tools they have, they're reasonably happy with what's going on. It's not a disaster at all. But the idea that you have low unemployment and low inflation at the same time as fairly low growth and what's going to happen next, they don't feel like they have a theory that really gives them guidance. And if you look at people who are charged with making foreign policy for a country, left or right, there used to be these debates between big schools of thought in foreign policy where there was a clear, distinct difference of opinion about the purpose of American foreign policy, how to think about the behavior of other countries. None of that really exists now. There's purely ad hoc policymaking. Ask somebody at the State Department, what do we actually want out of our relationship with China? You're not going to get a very good answer. And it is, I think, an unusual moment.
Well, is that because the consensus about promoting American interest is no longer there? If you look at what Trump said in foreign policy or in trade, it's America first, and this is about America. And we've had people
Trump,
who were perceived in real globalists.
I think that this is a matter of kind of running on fumes since the end of the Cold War, where we've tried to keep using the same frameworks that were useful during the Cold War after it, instead of coming to think about how the world now might be different. What would be unleashed by the lifting of this very powerful framework of East versus West? I think what's been unleashed is something like nationalism and populism and ethnic tensions and economic uncertainty, but we don't have a theoretical framework that lets us understand that. And look, theory has to follow practice. It's not as if we can't function without it, but it is strange how long we've continued to run on these fumes, and so in that sense, how long our policymakers have been left out to hang by the people who might otherwise help them think about the world and understand it.
Well, Arnold, you'd worked, coming back to your notions of economic academic work, I think it's very interesting that, as John Allison said at BB&T, the Fed's PhDs in economics have missed every single one of the market meltdowns in the last 100 years.
Well, especially the one 10 years ago. And, I've railed about this. I recently received pushback. Somebody said, well, have you read the Diamond and Dybvig model? And this is somebody who wrote
Diamond and Dybvig. We'll curl up with that later on.
Right. Anyway, and I had read it, and it actually is probably better than other stuff because it includes the possibility of bank runs. And so so people say, wow, we've had a model that allows for bank runs. Isn't that great? Well, that's wonderful, except you know nothing about credit default swaps, CDOs, any of the financial instruments that actually were involved in the financial crisis. And of course you didn't see it coming because you didn't even know what any of these things existed. So again, that's to me a dramatic illustration of the economy evolving in much more complex ways than economists are prepared to look at. So I won't rant about that anymore.
To come back where we've been, I think what I hear you saying is that in most of these academic disciplines, most of the disciplines that have guided leaders in the country, we're unmoored from the certainties we had in the 60s, both in terms of where we stand, who our enemies are in the world, and also in terms of the economic levers. We don't have the big corporations that are going to be doing the bidding of the
It's
of
not
the federal
what's
government.
good for General Motors is good for the country, and what's good for the country is good for General Motors. That's not, General Motors almost doesn't matter. Certainly not as much as it did in 1956.
So we're unmoored from the big ideas. Are people have some guidance here about where we think we could take this? I mean,
I think well, in a sense, Arnold's work points in this direction. I think the fact of fragmentation needs to be a place to start for social science. And the social science of fragmentation in different fields is not well developed. And if
by fragmentation we mean
I mean the breakdown of consolidated institutions and structures in society.
Let's give an example.
Yeah.
We still use the term working class, labor market. There's no working class anymore. If somebody came down from Mars and looked at our economy fresh, they would never come up with the idea of working class. They would see this huge divergence in occupations, this extreme specialization, different people with different skill sets. There's not this big homogeneous mass of people walking into assembly lines every morning. And so that's a clear example of you call it fragmentation, I call it disaggregation. Just we have many different economies. We have different economies in different cities, different economies by different education classes, different economies by different industries, different economies even within industries by sort of well-run, forward-thinking companies versus companies that are trying to hang on to older ways of doing things.
Well, since I come from the libertarian part of your three languages, sounds to me like it's a recipe for just stop trying to guide things from Washington, shut most of it down, and let the private sector and civil society do its job. And civil society is something we ought to touch on, because I think, as you talk about it, the subsidiarity idea of getting problems solved closest to the where they exist, you're likely to end up with a better outcome.
Look, a multitude of circumstances should suggest a multitude of problem solvers, rather than hoping that we finally find just the right MIT professor to figure out the healthcare system.
Well, we have Arnold.
Yeah, maybe the answer really is that this requires different kinds of solutions in different kinds of places. So to me, absolutely, the challenge of fragmentation or disaggregation points in the direction of less aggregated solutions.
Well, but let me push back, because I think the subsidiarity story is in some ways a form of nostalgia for when sort of we had this Tocquevillian world of religious institutions and clubs that incorporated.
Communitarian, we're barn raising together. We're
So why isn't that just another form of nostalgia?
Well, in some ways, America is more like that than it was in the mid 20th century. So there is some reason to look for ways in which we've dealt with immense diversity before. America in the 19th century was very fractured and fragmented. Its politics looked a lot like our politics. So there are reasons to look to that time. But I also think looking to something more like subsidiarity from here means looking to how we move forward from here to there, not backward. That is, it's more post-industrial than industrial. And the question is, how do we make our politics more like what works in our economic life and in other parts of our life? And in the 21st century, what works tends to be customized and tends to operate by giving people choices and options rather than by giving them prefabricated solutions. And so it seems to me that this is a way of thinking about how to modernize our politics as much as it is a way of learning from the past.
From my world of investing and business, particularly private equity, venture capital, the businesses you want to invest in are the ones that are the most focused, highly specialized in dealing with a specific problem, either good or service. And those are the ones that create little monopolies in their niche because nobody else can do it better, faster, cheaper than they can. But that comes from intense specialization. And yet when we talk about these other ideas about not having a cohesive foreign policy or this sort of thing, I kind of lose where that would fit into our model here, but in economics, in any case, I think you're arguing for radical, disaggregation, decentralization of things.
Yeah.
Letting people solve these problems.
Yeah, but
Where it's possible. The idea of subsidiarity is not just going down to the lowest level, but
real quick,
the
for
lowest
those of
level
us
that's
that are new to that word, define
so
subsidiarity.
Subsidiarity is really a word that's imported from Catholic social teaching, more or less. But the idea is basically that power should reside as close to the level of the community as reasonable. So it's not always go down to the lowest possible level, but when confronted with a problem, think, could this be solved locally? If it could be, then it should be. If it can't be, then we have to think about higher levels of government or higher levels of solutions. But to have a preference for the local.
Can we come back to the polarization, to the three languages, the issues that Arnold raised? I live in a rural county in Virginia. We have 6,000 people, and we are divided pretty much in half, right and left. And there's some hard right and there's some hard left. And if you get people together at lunch, pretty quickly they'll start talking national politics, and then they hate each other. But then if you start talking about whether we need a bike trail or not, you really can't tell what their politics are because they're into the local solution mode. And is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, there are ways in which dealing with problems locally means being more practical about them. Ideology doesn't go away, and political differences don't go away, but you're forced to think about questions a little bit less abstractly, and you're forced to deal with people as human beings in front of you. And that does help some. Some of the problems we have with polarization are about abstracting away from human beings to these sorts of broad general ideas we have about other people. It's not always avoidable, but where it is avoidable, it's worth trying to avoid.
But just a random concern, we're thinking that it would be nice if politics would be more like other forms of life, and it seems like we're going in the other direction. With people asking corporations to announce which side you're on political issues. Just I don't know. There's some.
I'm not saying things are going well, Arnold. Don't get me wrong.
How would we get?
I think we know the what. What we like. I think what we might agree on is this decentralization, disaggregation, solving. Right. How do we get there?
Yeah.
And how do we tamp down on this tendency to make things so political and get so wound up over it? I hope that we're just going through a period of learning how to deal with our new media, and people people see something on Facebook and they say, "Oh, I've got to jump on that, and I've got to participate in that, and I've got to sort of like that or hate that." So somehow adjusting away from being sort of social media addicts to being like community oriented would be a helpful change, but I don't know how we get from here to there.
Speaking of living in a rural county, we had a massive windstorm, blew down trees. We were without internet for, I don't know, 3-4 days.
Yeah, sounds great.
It was great.
Yeah, I do think that putting it in terms of adjusting to this new reality is probably right, or at least is the hopeful way to think about it. Which is to say, we're getting used to dealing with new tools and with new media, and at this point, we have not found quite the right balance and quite the right way, and we're letting the tools we have distract us or misshape our interactions with one another. And among other things, we're mistaking the expression of opinion for engagement and activity, so that you just kind of put something out there and people respond with a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or somebody sends around some statement of outrage about something that happened, and you like it on Facebook and you feel like you've done something. That's just a mistake about whether you've done something or not. But it channels the energy that might go into actual civic activity into something that's a lot less than civic activity. I hope that that's something that we kind of learn our way out of over time, but obviously it's hard to say.
When we say we, who do we mean by we? I mean, that's as a public policy guy, explain to me who the we is that's going to bring this about.
Look, first and foremost, it's just each of us as a citizen. And
it dawns on us that we've got to change. It
dawns on us that we're not happy with the status quo. I don't think any of us are too far from that realization. Right. People are not happy with the status quo. And so the question is, what can be done that's different, and how can it help us get out of the frustration that we're feeling. It would take some leadership. It would take someone saying, maybe if we tried to address this problem at the state level, at the local level, or maybe just saying you're angry on Twitter isn't actually anything. But, you know, who is it that ought to change? I think in a free country, it's you, it's me.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing, that you sort of you start with yourself and look at what you're doing. Is it constructive? Do you feel like you're solving the problems in your own life? And if you're not even solving the problems in your own life, then probably you're not going to be solving other people's.
Well, I've written on my website that I don't believe, my view is that 95% of the problems we face in life cannot be solved through politics. It's got to be solved through everything else: family, vocation, taking care of your health, things like that. Yet we seem to spend 5% of our time on the 5% thing that we can't really do much about anyway.
Yeah. Well, I hope most people don't spend as much time on politics as I do, but
I was looking at you.
Yeah,
when I said
I know. It's hard for me to make this complaint
this was
because I've
your
kind of chosen to be here. I don't really. Look, I agree. I think that it is in some ways also a function of our kind of media environment that we are constantly flooded with news that demands our attention and reaction about national politics. That's not everybody's experience, but it is a lot of people's experience, and especially in this kind of moment. You know, I think the sheer fact that people are not simply satisfied with how this is going suggests that there's at least an opening for different ways of thinking about how to solve both our own problems, our community's problems, ultimately our country's problems, that aren't simply politics broadly understood. I think there is an openness for that. There's a demand, but there is a shortage of supply, and that should look like an opportunity to people in public life.
Yeah, I guess one vision I have is a media that is not advertising driven, because I think that creates a lot of pathologies, because because you're advertising driven, you need to get people to pay attention. In order to get people to pay attention, you've got to feed outrage. And so maybe if business models evolve differently, and I think for a variety of reasons, people are getting a little, or more than a little, frustrated with the advertising model that's behind Google and Facebook, that they see that the adverse incentives that creates, and that may at some point create an opportunity for somebody to come into that, to use the term space, to go into those businesses with a different model and appeal to people and draw some people away from that and get away from those.
It is worth saying we're early in the kind of new media world, and it may be that this just isn't how things settle down, and that this is not the sustainable model. You know, we are adjusting to a new set of arrangements. I can see, I hire people out of college just about every year to work at National Affairs, and I can just tell you over the last few years that what you find when you look at people's social media presence when you're considering them for a job has changed for the better dramatically in the last few years, as people have become aware that what they put out there is ultimately going to be looked at by other people when they're adults. And it's something that as if they just didn't know 10 years ago, and now they do. And that's a kind of social learning that I would like to think happens. I'd like to think happens on a broader scale in our society. There are all kinds of ways that we use social media and other new media now that, if they don't work for us, we may just end up changing them.
Well, you both know I worked in the Trump transition and watched people try to get jobs in the Trump administration, and not surprisingly, our president, who does understand tweeting, the first thing they looked at was the social media history of every single wannabe, and in many cases it wasn't a good record, and they didn't end up with a job. But then,
I think college kids are more aware of that now than they used to be, because they're just told it. It wasn't as obvious a few years back.
Well, we're wandering into. We could go with you guys. We could probably cover every topic on the planet. Let's bring this back to where we started with the languages and the fractured republic. Give me some reason for optimism about where we can start communicating with each other.
Well, so optimism, I don't really quite believe in optimism. I believe in hope. Optimism is just expecting good things to happen.
Okay.
I wouldn't do that. But hope is the belief that the resources are there for good things to happen. Hope drives you to act. And I think there are a lot of reasons for hope. I think, first of all the things we complain about how America's changed over the past half century or so, are the opposite sides of the coin of things that have been good and how America's changed. We are a more dynamic country. We have more options in every realm of life. It gives us a lot of strengths, and we should be grateful for those. And I also think, again, the sheer fact that we are not satisfied with how things are going in our politics means that there is a demand out there for ways of doing better. So I don't think that we just remain in this phase of dissatisfied frustration. I think we're going to see various kinds of ideas get thrown up against the wall. Some of them are going to be very bad, but they're not all going to be very bad. This is a country that is inventive in times of trouble, and I don't think that's changed. So I am hopeful.
And we're going to read about these in National Affairs.
Absolutely.
Okay. Arnold?
I think my hope for optimism comes from some of the feedback I've been getting on the Three Languages book, which is I think there are a lot of people, I would almost call it a silent majority, who are not as polarized, who are not as ideologically committed, and who are willing to see the other side. So I think there is a demand out there for some people for some more moderation, and it'll be interesting to see whether that manages to manifest itself in politics or whether the primary system and the other things keep it from happening. But I think there are a lot of people who want peace and not civil war, and sometimes I think that's true in places that even have wars. Most of the people don't really want them, so you can't count on the fact that most people want peace to generate peace, but it does give you hope.
I agree, and I can't recommend enough that everyone, or you, my audience, pick up a copy of The Three Languages of Politics and The Fractured Republic, because what they both do, they're both very interesting in terms of breaking down paradigms and breaking about how you think about things, and I think that's the first step to the kind of things that we want to achieve. So thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Arnold, where can you be reached? ArnoldKling.com?
That's the best place.
Okay.
Yeah, start there.
Yuval?
I'm at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, so eppc.org is a good place to find me.
eppc.org. Okay, we got that. All right, thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
America is divided into three separate moral universes: conservative, progressive, and libertarian. And we're also living in an age of political nostalgia where for the left, 1965 and the Great Society is the best time for them, and for Republicans, it's 1981 and the Reagan Revolution. But the explosion of diversity and specialization in America today means our country looks completely different. This requires a completely new and different worldview. A more fragmented society requires more targeted solutions. One solution is the so-called concept of subsidiarity. The idea is basically that power should reside at the level of the community, as close as possible to the problem. The way you think about this is, could it be solved locally? If it could be, then it should be. I see this playing out all the time where I live in rural Virginia. When politics come up and people talk about national issues, it almost always leads to the type of heated, damaging discussion we see on social media. On the other hand, local issues often trigger an instinct of pragmatism and cooperation. Think about it. If we want solutions, we should start work with the principle of subsidiarity. It's a bit of an awkward word, but it works. It means local people solving local problems together.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe at thebillwaltonshow.com or on iTunes.